This is the Rich Dad Radio Show. The good news and bad news about money. Here's Robert Kiyosaki.
Hello. Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and the bad news about money. And today we have another one of those programs, especially for those of you who have $1 million idea or have an idea that you want to go viral, as they say today. Or how do you write a hit song or a hit book? Is that an accident or is there a science to it? So for all of you who would be or want to be or are entrepreneurs who want to hit the hit list, I've been on the New York Times bestseller list for over 7 years. That was a hit. Rich Dad Poor Dad. In fact, I had 5 out of 10 books on the New York Times bestseller list. Unprecedented. But anyway, it's how do you create a hit, be it a product, a viral thing, a video, a message, a business. How do you stay viral almost? That really what it comes down to. So it's a very important program for all of you who want to know, is there a science? Is there something you can know to create a hit, whatever it is, hit song and all this. And I used to be in the rock and roll business, and one of the worst things you could be classified as is a one-hit wonder. You hit one song. There was a song called Runaway, I think came out in the 50s or the 60s by Del Shannon. He only had one hit. And every time he toured, nobody wanted to hear his other songs. All they wanted to hear is Runaway. As I walk alone, I wonder. And so being in kind of the hit business, I've had number one product in sporting goods and things like this. I was always terrified of being a one-hit wonder. So for those of you who want to understand the science, the thought, the logic of what creates something to be a hit, this is your show. This is the most important show for you. So our guest today is Derek Thompson. He is the author of the book Hit Makers. I asked him if he was still in high school. He's very lucky. He looks like a teenager. But he is the senior editor of Atlantic Magazine. So he's an amazingly accomplished young man, also a young-looking man. And his book, Hit Makers, is a must for all entrepreneurs, singers, marketing guys, anybody who needs to create a hit or create some buzz or have people pay attention to you. So Hit Makers by Derek Thompson. It's the science of popularity in an age of distraction. And I was talking to Derek before we went on. I said, I've already used a lot of the thing. I started using even more of what he recommends in the book. I also want to pat myself on the back unabashedly, but I've used many of these things. It wasn't taught to me in my MBA program. None of this was. It's how do you create a hit? What makes the Mona Lisa the Mona Lisa? Have you ever been to the Louvre and all that? There's thousands and thousands of artists that are better than the Mona Lisa. I remember the first time I saw the Mona Lisa, I said, is that it? Why is that thing a hit? It doesn't make sense to me. You tour the great galleries of Europe, especially in America or in the world. What makes something a hit and what something not? Why is it popular? And many people think, well, I have a great product or I put the most money into it, the most information into it, and it's high quality. No, it's BS. There's a science to creating a hit. So, Derek, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you, man. How did you come up to start writing this book called Hit Makers?
I came up with the idea for Hit Makers because I was an economics writer at the Atlantic Magazine, and I've been writing about macroeconomics and the labor force for a bit, and I wanted to use economics and psychology in other industries, see what sort of answers it could yield in places away from sort of classical labor market economics. And I started writing about the television business. And what I found really interesting about television is that there was an economic business model that I thought was responsible for the hits that appeared on TV that was invisible to most TV consumers. So in other words, you could say that business models that television consumers couldn't see were responsible for the hits that they could see. And I thought that was sort of a funny idea, and I wanted to write a little bit more about it. And I realized that as I went along, to really understand why hits happened, you had to use a little bit of economics, a little bit of psychology, a little bit of sociology as well. And then a book sort of became born out of that big question. Why do we like what we like? Why do some ideas and products become so extraordinarily successful when products that are really, really similar fail? And those were the big questions that led to this book.
Well, some of the examples you use in your book, Hitmaker, again, the science of popularity, and this is the most important line, in an age of distraction. And so why Derek Thompson's book, so important is because there's more distraction than ever before. When I was a kid, there was only one TV station. Imagine that. Everybody had to watch that one station. Now there's, 600 billion of them? Every PC, every iPhone, everything. It's a television station today. How do you get somebody's attention? So that's why Hitmakers, all you guys who are entrepreneurs or songwriters or dreamers or movie producers or marketing guys, Hitmakers is your book, because Derek goes back in time. He goes back through history and explains why certain things like the Mona Lisa or Chagall or the Impressionists are more popular than other painters, right? So
yeah, that's right.
But the big one right now, I like, is it's in the news every day, is a guy that sucked most brain attention out of the universe lately is President Trump. Is that correct?
Yes, he absolutely has. There's no question about that.
There is no space for anything but Trump today. Is that correct?
That is right. The human brain is technically real estate, and the president, before he was the president, was a real estate mogul, and you could say that his greatest ever acquisition was essentially the mind space of every single American for the last 18 months.
Yeah, and so I'm going to say the reason Trump is important is because I can't get any PR time. I used to depend upon going on to Fox and Friends and all this stuff and, Cavuto's show, but they don't talk anything about Trump today. So what did he do?
So that's a great question. What is Trump doing that makes it so impossible for us to stop paying attention to him? I think on the one hand, one thing that Trump definitely realized is that the media is obsessed with covering relatable, outrageous controversies. And during the campaign trail, when the Republican primary was so full of people, he was really, really talented at coming up with some new controversy every single day so that MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News just had to cover him. And one thing I found really interesting is that, typically throughout presidential history, it's the candidates with the most amount of money that have been able to run away with these primaries. People like, Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio, who had the most money from the big-time donors. Trump did not have that much money. He didn't spend that much money, but he didn't need to. And the reason he didn't need to is because he got a bunch of free coverage, free media, free advertising from the cable news channels. And so he sort of co-opted these distribution networks that already existed in order to distribute his message. And I really think that in many ways, if you think about the fundamental challenge of any media company today, what is it? It's precisely that. It's to co-opt distribution channels that you don't control. Get people you don't know to tweet about you.
Everybody listen. Everybody listen. That is the key word, is distribution, not product. A lot of guys come up to me. I have a great product. I say, well, how are you going to distribute it? Oh, it's a great product. It's got high quality. But anyway, the thing I'm interested in about Trump, he called people names. He calls Marco Rubio, who had millions and millions and millions of dollars, he calls him Little Marco. And then Jeb Bush, who had a war chest that was bigger than the U.S. Treasury, he calls him Low Energy Bush. What was that doing?
Yeah, it was incredibly childish. That's certainly true. It's interesting. I think that I'm in the media, right? Like, I live in New York City. I'm a part of the media establishment that Trump says he hates. To me,
but he actually loves you guys, doesn't he? He actually loves.
I'm glad you said that. No,
he loves you guys.
That's something that a lot of people do not understand is that Trump says he hates the media, but he is more obsessed with the media than any president in American history. He adores the press. He has pictures of himself from the press all over his office, front pages and magazine pages and tabloid pages. They're like, mirrors on the wall all over his
I've been in his
pages.
office. I've lived in his office for about 4 or 5 months. So we wrote 2 books together. That's why. So I know I'm not popular with the media either. So anyway, except for Fox.
That's crazy. That's really interesting. So I think what's really important to point out, though, is that to someone like me, Trump is utterly shocking. He's a novelty, right? You just don't have presidential candidates talk like this. He is weird. But to a lot of voters, he's not weird at all. He sounds like a friend. He sounds like an immature buddy who is just talking to the press the way that people talk around each other when they're sort of having beers. He stands on ceremony for nobody. And I think that was really appealing to people. And more than that, very simply, at a policy level, I think it's important to point out that Trump espoused policies on immigration and on Muslims and even on race in the U.S.
And women.
And women, oh, God, absolutely, on women. It was absolutely outside the bounds of normal conversation. And in many ways, I'll say, without getting too political on this show, outside the bounds of propriety. But in many ways, the way that he was talking would be extremely familiar to anybody who spent their days, listening to right-wing talk radio. And so I think that one big idea in my book is that fundamentally, even though people like to think that they're into novelty, they're into originality, they love new things, fundamentally we're suckers for the familiar. We like familiar ideas and familiar products, particularly when they have sort of new tweaks on them. And so to have an extremely familiar celebrity break all sort of political boundaries while espousing what are relatively familiar ideas to a right-wing audience, that is, I think, in many ways upholding a thesis of my book.
Right.
So in many ways, my book predicted Trump in a way that I guess I myself did not.
Right. But the other thing you talk about is that, in today we have like the Kardashian Instagram post, or we could get something on the Drudge Report. But I think what you really are talking about is I couldn't wait to hear what Trump was going to say next. It was nothing relevant about the news. He was just he's entertaining.
I couldn't agree more. Yep, I couldn't agree more. I mean, he was, and to a certain extent, he still is. Like, even though I think that his candidacy is and his presidency has put some people in danger, I think that people who despise the president are still waiting with bated breath for that morning tweet, right?
I know.
So in many ways, I kind of think it's like, when there's an enormous thunderstorm that's outside your window, like how kids love just like pressing their nose against the window to watch the lightning and to hear the thunder and watch the wind blow the rain. And at the same time, so there's amazement, but there's also a bit of fear, right? Like the thunderstorm might flood the house.
Right.
Like that's Donald Trump right now.
Right.
Like he might flood the house, but it's also kind of entertaining to put your nose against the glass and just watch the storm.
This is Derek Thompson. His book is called Hit Makers. Very important book for any entrepreneur, has a product, a songwriter, marketing person, or somebody who just wants to get some attention in a world that's so overly communicated, so much distraction. How do you find somebody to pay attention to you? The book, again, is called Hit Makers, and when we come back, we'll be talking to Derek more, not about Trump, but some of the fundamentals, the science of popularity in an age of distraction.
You're listening to The Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Thanks for tuning in to The Rich Dad Radio Show. If you like what you're hearing, go to iTunes or Android, subscribe to the show, and leave a rating and review to help other financially minded people like you find The Rich Dad Radio Show. Thanks for tuning in and keep on learning.
Every business owner and real estate investor needs asset protection. Entities like LLCs, S or C Corps are vital to protect yourself and your business. Let Corporate Direct guide you through the process of forming a corporation or LLC. Corporate Direct is owned by Rich Dad advisor Garrett Sutton and is Robert Kiyosaki's choice for corporate formation. Mention Rich Dad and receive $100 off a formation. Call 800-600-1760. That's 800-600-1760. Or visit online at corporatedirect.com. That's corporatedirect.com.
It pays to listen. Now back to Robert Kiyosaki and the Rich Dad Radio Show.
Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. And today we're talking about hits. How do you create a hit in a world of distraction? And the distraction is exponentially increasing, especially with the clouds, cell phones, technology, Snapchat, Facebook, and all this. How do you get any attention? How do you create a hit out there? You can listen to the Rich Dad Radio program anytime, anywhere on iTunes or Android. We can go to our podcast on richdadradio.com. And the reason we archive these programs is so you can listen to them again, because repetition, and that's kind of what makes a hit is repetition, is key to learning. You've got to, you can't swing a golf club once and turn pro. So repetition is the key. So if you listen, go to richdadradio.com, listen to this program on hit makers. What does it take to become a hit? A song, a product, whatever it is, a book. What does it take? You listen to this again, you'll be a little bit smarter, but most importantly, you may have friends or family who are interested in the same subject. So you go to Rich Dad Radio program, download it, and share it with friends, family, or business associates. Our guest today is Derek Thompson. He has a very, very crucially important book today, especially in a world of too much distraction, too much. And Derek is a young guy. He's the editor of Atlantic Magazine, and his book is on the history, the psychology, but the reason certain people or products become hits. And we just talked about Donald Trump. What the heck did he do? He blew 16 guys off the stage by being a complete idiot. I mean, I can't believe what he was saying. But it worked. Why did it work? But let's now go back in time, and Derek's going to explain how certain artwork, like the Mona Lisa or Impressionists, becomes so popular. So, Derek, historically, what causes something to become a hit?
This is a great, difficult, awesome question that I try to investigate through several stories. I think the most important scientific principle, before we get into individual stories, the most important scientific principle here is one of the first discoveries in the history of psychology. It's called the mere exposure effect. And the mere exposure effect says that the mere exposure of any stimulus to us, whether it's a painting or a song or a food cuisine or a type of speech, biases us toward that thing over time. So familiarity tends to breed liking. Right. We tend to enjoy things that we recognize, particularly if we're somewhat surprised by them. So, for example, we might not want to listen to the same song 17 times in a row, but one reason why FM Top 40 radio works is that people are tuning in to hear songs they've heard before, just in a surprising order. They want to hear Drake. They want to hear Justin Bieber. They want to hear Katy Perry. They want to hear songs they know, but in a surprising order. So we like familiarity when it comes as a surprise.
But that's also,
so what does this have to do?
But also you pointed out that's why in Hollywood sequels do better than new movies many times.
Right, exactly. Yeah. What do people want to spend, whatever movies cost these days, $10, $15 if you live in New York City, $20 if you go to a nice theater. What do you want to spend $20 on? Do you want to spend $20 on a story when you have no idea who these characters are, no confidence that you're going to love them, no confidence that you're going to be emotionally invested in the story? Or are you only willing to part with that $20 when you have that little bit of confidence that it's part of a familiar structure, a familiar meta-narrative about your favorite superhero?
Which is like
Star Wars, and comic books, and Pirates of the Caribbean. Every single year this century, a majority of the top 10 films in the U.S. have been adaptations, sequels, or reboots. We like surprising variations on familiar substances.
But that's what you call. What does it have to do? But that's what you call Maya, right? That's your.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
most advanced yet acceptable.
Maya, right? Maya is from the second chapter of the book. Maya is a acronym coined by Raymond Loewy, the father of industrial design, the man responsible for designing the most famous car and bus and logos, the 1950s, the interior of the NASA spaceship. It stands for most advanced yet acceptable, Maya. And it essentially says that we love things that are complex. We love things that are complicated, that make us think, so long as they are fundamentally familiar and acceptable to us. And I think this is a powerful idea, not only in storytelling or in music writing, but also I think in journalism too. You know, one of my jobs is to find new and surprising and interesting ways of explaining ideas that are complex, but make the takeaway simple enough that people can remember it. Because people only like the take, they only like the opinion piece or the essay if they can remember what it was all about, if it's simple enough to be portable.
So if I could give,
and this is a really powerful idea.
Yeah, so if I could explain why Rich Dad took office in 1996, I wanted to bring financial education, which is not taught anywhere in schools today. How do I bring it to the public? And the way I did it was Monopoly. Most people throughout the world have played Monopoly, so I took cash flow, adapted it, added a financial statement to it, and then people wonder why it was a success. But the reason it was a success is people were used to Monopoly, but cash flow was the next most advanced, very advanced, in fact, with a financial statement. But when I was reading your book, I said, God, that's what I did. I just took something everybody knew about, but I just took it one step further, a little bit more complex. Is that correct?
I think it's totally true. You know, I think that there's an enormous genre of business books out there, and you know, the worst of them do little more than essentially repackage conventional wisdom. But the best of them find a new frame to make people understand familiar and important ideas that are already out there in the mainstream, but there hasn't quite been a hooky way to make sure that people remember it. You know, lots of the fundamentals, I think, about, you know, finance, for example, about personal finance, are relatively, you know, straightforward, right? Like, don't spend more than you earn. Make sure that you save a little bit. Feel free to splurge.
Derek, that's definitely not my philosophies or Trump's. So just understand. Yeah. So
right.
we had to take people from a poor man's philosophy to a rich man's philosophy. That's what we did.
Right. Oh,
no, I spent a lot more than I earn. But I use debt to get there, and most people can't use debt. That was my message. Just know that.
Right. Oh, it's interesting.
And Trump and I are 100% debt, and the average guy can't use debt.
He says he's a debt guy.
Yep.
And
taxes. We don't pay taxes.
Okay.
And that drives a lot of people crazy.
Yeah, and I can imagine that. But fundamentally, though, I think that there's a handful of like important ideas out there in the world that are waiting for a good frame to make sure that people remember it. I think that, you know, many of the best writers are those who not only come up with the best ideas, but also come up with the most significant frames. It's both
wait. Did you call it a frame?
I called it a frame. Yes.
It's also a context, right?
Yeah, it's context. You can think of it as context, as marketing, as merchandising, or even as memory candy.
Right.
That's how I refer to it at one point in the book. That, you know, writing I think a good book isn't just about coming up with the right ideas. It's also coming up with the right way to make sure that the readers remember them. Because, you know, a book is an 8-hour reading experience sometimes, or a 5 to 10-hour reading experience. People are only going to like it, though, if they come away with an insight that's maybe only 15 seconds long. So, you know, some personal finance columns, some personal finance books' insight might be, you know, spend less than you earn. Your book might be spend more than you earn, go into debt, use America's financial laws in order to get ahead, and take advantage of the rules that are on the books to become a rich person.
Yeah,
right?
but
the point
not
is that it only works if it's simple enough.
But not written by rich people. That's the rich. That's why Trump and I get into so much trouble with the finance guys. Hey, once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show. We're talking to Derek Thompson. What is the key to creating a hit? And his book is Hitmakers, The Science and Popularity in an Age of Distraction, because you have more competition today. Well, let's go back to the thing about the hit. When we talked about the Mona Lisa versus all this, there's a science to it. And I want to promote your book, Hitmakers, because for those of you who want to understand how it's done, Derek has gone through history. We just talked about Trump. We talked about my book. But we've got to understand how they did it through history. So what makes the Mona Lisa or other artwork more popular than others when there's better artists out there?
Yeah, the fascinating thing about the Mona Lisa is historians have gone back to the middle of the 19th century, and they've shown that the Mona Lisa at the time, in 1849, was valued at about 90,000 francs. That sounds like a decent amount of francs, a tidy sum. But Titian had a painting that was valued at 150,000 francs. Raphael's Holy Family at 60,000. So the Mona Lisa wasn't even the most valuable painting on its own haul in the middle of the 19th century, even though it's the most famous painting in the world today. So what happened? The answer is basically that it got an assist from a thief. In 1911, an unemployed Italian painter walked into the Louvre and stole the Mona Lisa. It kicked off an international manhunt for this painting. When they finally tracked it down in France, it had become an absolute sensation on the cover of every newspaper in the world as there was this manhunt. Now, what does that sound like a bit compared to our earlier conversation? It sounds a bit like Trump. Right?
Yeah.
The Mona Lisa found its way onto the cover of every single newspaper in the world.
I don't know. Are you calling Trump the Mona Lisa or the thief?
Yeah, I think I'm probably the first person ever to compare Trump to the Mona Lisa. But
no, I think he's a guy that kicked 19 guys off the stage. That was a thief. I hear so many people. He stole this election. It's what causes something to be a hit, or today's genre goes viral. How do you do that? And I guess what you're saying is Trump was the bigger distraction. So for you who may want to be more successful, better products, better marketing people, you'll find out how to become a better distraction.
You're listening to the Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Rich Dad Coaching offers a phenomenal variety of services and custom strategies, all aimed at ensuring a secure, comfortable, and rich future for you and your family. Now you can get weekly access to exclusive Rich Dad coaching services through our live stream events. Go to richdad.com and click on the on-demand banner at the top of the homepage. Great new videos are updated regularly. Get inside knowledge and insights from Robert Kiyosaki himself, Rich Dad coaching professionals, and more. Go to richdad.com and click on the on-demand banner at the top of the homepage.
This is the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. Here's Robert Kiyosaki.
Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. Today we're talking about a very important subject. It's called how do you create a hit? How do you get something that goes viral? How do you write a book that's a bestseller? How do you make a movie? How do you write a song? And today the book we're talking about is Hit Makers, The Science of Popularity in an Age of Trump. Age of Distraction. And our guest today is the author of the book, Derek Thompson. Again, the book is Hitmakers, very important book for all of you in marketing, especially entrepreneurs. And once again, you can listen to the Rich Dad Radio program anytime, anywhere on iTunes or Android. And all of our programs are archived at richdadradio.com. We archive them so you can listen to again, because repetition, and you're going to find that's one way to create a hit, is via repetition is the way we learn. Our guest today is Derek Thompson. I'm going to just share with Derek how your book, Hitmakers, has already helped me a lot in the age of Trump, of distraction.
Oh, great.
And what happens is Rich Dad, Poor Dad was because it was had to be self-published, Derek, 20 years ago, because every editor said I had no idea what I was talking about in finance. They say I use debt, I don't save money, I spend more than I earn, I do everything like that, like Trump does. And we pay very little in taxes legally. It drove them nuts. Yep. So, and then Rich Dad, Poor Dad, like you said, very simple story, true story, the frame or the context. I have one dad who was PhD from Stanford and all that, talking to me, a little kid, 9 years old, and my rich dad who never went to school, and they have completely different points of view. And that's why we have this battle today that, Bernie Sanders, the senator, ran against Hillary. They have this gap growing. Really a big gap. So I wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad 20 years ago because I could see this gap coming. But what happened was, so I got a lot of PR and, radio, television, Oprah, Trump. I was on every program. Fox used to call me up and all this. But in the age of Trump, I don't get PR because he sucked the air out of the room. So I read your book, Hitmakers, and I'm going, okay, I'm looking for the new idea, which your book provided. And I said, well, as you said, there's a reader of my book, and that's my customer. But as you said in Hitmakers, who is your customer's audience? And so what I said, I can't get on, in the age of Trump, I'm not on television, which really that's distribution, exposure, familiarity, as you talk about. So this is bad news for me. So what I did was I created a thing called Rich Dad TV. And the reason I created Rich Dad TV, it's television in a book. And where I got that idea from was marrying your ideas and me being on that, it's a thing called TED Talks or something. And so I'm on TED Talks, and it's a 20-minute presentation. So what the new book I'm coming out with is called Why the Rich Are Getting Richer, What is Financial Education Really? I put television or PR in the age of Trump inside my next book. It's called Rich Dad Television. So the idea is the person who buys my book is my customer. Rich Dad Television is my method of my customer talking to his or her audience. Does that make sense to you?
It absolutely makes sense. Yeah. So there's two things in there that I think are really important to unpack. The first thing is there's a long chapter in my book called The Audience of Your Audience. And This is the idea that when you're making something, you shouldn't just make it for the person who is going to buy it. Give the person who's going to buy it something to say so that they can share it with their audience. There's one more point that I think is really important, which is that, I talk a lot about distraction in this book, right? The age of distraction. The number of books that have been published worldwide has grown by a factor of 7 since the 1980s. Right. 7. The number of original scripted dramas on television has grown by a factor of 7 just since the early 2000s. We are surrounded with stuff. There is so much stuff out there that nothing can actually become majoritarian popular, which is to say nothing is liked or bought by more than 50% of the consumers that you reach. So what you should do is not aim to make something that's going to appeal to everybody, but rather make something that's going to really, really make a certain segment of that population completely obsessed with your idea. And that, I think, is how hits are most reliably made. Even if a book sells, 1 million copies, it's a little bit less than yours, but it's still quite a lot. Let's say it sells 1 million copies. That still means that 99% of Americans didn't buy it. So even the biggest book of the year might not necessarily be bought by 99% of Americans. So if you think about that and realize that success equals 1%, success means just 1% of the total country buying your product, then you really see that making a hit is not about making the most popular thing possible. It's about making something that's going to engender a devoted cult. Right. And so culture, I think, is about cults all the way down. Right.
And also, you may not know about my product line, why it became, I'm still in the top 3 books after 20 years. And one of the reasons.
That's remarkable.
The reason I had to write Rich Dad, Poor Dad is because, as you say, Maya, most advanced yet acceptable, everybody understood monopoly, but they didn't understand my new game, Cashflow. It was more complex. Financial statement. So I wrote a book called, which is a true story, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Only reason I wrote the book was to sell the game.
Right, exactly.
And the game took off.
This is merchandising. This is the last chapter of the book. This is all about how Disney went from being a little comics company to being the media empire of the world. They were the first movie company to realize that the future of the movie business wasn't in the movie theater. It was in department stores.
But the beauty of your book, Hitmakers, The Science of Popularity in an Age of Distraction, I wrote my book for my customer, and inadvertently I was actually doing it for his audience, his friends and family. That's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to think about it, is that you're the most important group of people in your consumer base are not the people that you're selling to necessarily, but the many, many people that they're going to talk to, right? Because that's where they do your distribution for you, right? So let's say a couple thousand people, many, many thousand people listen to this podcast. If they're not all going to buy the book, I'd love it if they did, but they're probably not going to. The success of this podcast or my book is about whether or not they talk about it with their friends, right? Do my distribution for me. And this is just one of the most powerful concepts, I think, in culture and in popularity, is How do you make products? How do you make ideas that aren't just worth consuming, but also worth talking about?
In the old days, it wasn't called viral; it was called word of mouth, and that's
right.
And that's what I depended upon. And the reason, when we designed the Rich Dad Radio Show, the reason we archive all of these programs is not for necessarily our listener, but for our listeners, friends, family, and business associates, because they may not listen to the program, but the person who did listen to the program will talk to them about your book, Hitmakers. And that's really
that's
what
right.
we don't have anything to sell. We don't sell stocks, bonds, mutual funds, or real estate, but we sell education. We promote education. It's free out there, because my whole concern is the crush. You and I were talking about earlier about UI, universal income, that people are not going to have those high-paying jobs. And what does a person do? So that's why your book, Hitmakers, and my book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and stuff like this, is really to give those people who know that the old world is dead and the new world has become. Just like Amazon bought Whole Foods. And Whole Foods prides itself on all their employees having good benefits and features and salaries, but Amazon buying Whole Foods now sucked the wind out of every grocery business in America. Would you agree with that?
It's remarkable. I mean, you saw after this Amazon purchase of Whole Foods, the stock of every other grocer and retailer just went into an absolute nosedive. They are like my friend joked, the scariest words in the English language are Jeff Bezos just entered your industry. It is so incredibly terrifying, I think, to these grocers to be competing with a company that is so low margin, that has so little profit, and can just ramp up on revenue. There's that, but then there's also, I think, as you pointed out, the human implications. If Amazon opens up a lot of shops that don't have cashiers and retail salespeople, the two most common jobs in America, by the way, cashiers and retail salespeople, what does that mean for the future of employment? It's going to be really, really interesting to follow this story, because it really might be one of the more important economic stories in the country.
And to all my friends out in Australia, where I spent many, many years working, Amazon just entered Australia. And those guys it's called margin. Some people call it fat. They're going to suck the margins and the fat out of all those jobs and economy and stuff like this. Everybody should read your book, Hitmakers, because it's time that you understood business rather than just hope for a high-paying job. Because I think the idea of a high-paying job for majority of people is pretty much a dinosaur. Would you agree with that, Derek?
Well, I do think that, with the rise of the Internet and the rise of potentially automating technologies, two things you could say are happening. On the one hand, you could say that it is reasonable to think that lots of jobs that people have come to depend on are going away because of technology in the future. And second, that because the Internet allows ordinary individuals to connect with consumers they could never reach otherwise,
Amen.
Individuals can become hitmakers themselves.
Right. So the last question for you is, for our listeners, what was the last thing you say? What were the big takeaway idea to make creating a hit, whatever that is, a song or whatever it is? And speaking of songs, you start with the song Lullaby or something, how that was a hit. And things like why, but it wasn't an instant overnight hit. It was a compilation of things. But your book, Hitmakers, in the Science of Popularity, Age of Trump or Distraction, by Derek Thompson, what would you say to that person listening right now, especially if they're working in Australia or working for Whole Foods and they're kind of fat and happy with their paycheck?
Yeah, this is a great question, right? So here's what I would say. Here's a little story. I went to Tokyo recently, and I'm walking around Tokyo, and my friend points out the fact that in Tokyo you can have really, really strange stores that sell, 1970s vinyl and weird whiskey, and it can survive in Tokyo, even though it's a really, really strange store, because there are 35 million people in Tokyo who are connected to the downtown city, right? So you don't have to make something that is mainstream for it to be a hit.
Right.
And what I would say is that the world is becoming Tokyo. To get big, you can aim small. You can make something that only a handful of people absolutely adore, and through the Internet find many, many people just like them, and that is the way to make a hit.
Amen, amen, amen. Hey, Derek, like I said, you look like a teenager for a 31-year-old. I mean, I don't know how you know so much, how you gain so much, but your book is a must for anybody today who realizes the idea that they can have a job for life and the economy is going to stay the same, or, you've got to read your book, especially if you want to understand. Not even making a hit, I think, is just how do you become a better marketer and survive. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
I didn't want to just write this for people who were, making songs or, making movies and television shows. This is supposed to be for anybody,
right?
No matter what your business is, how to make something that people like.
Yeah, and that's what I love about your book. You go through history, which I love history. But, we started with a day and age of Trump, but we go back to the Mona Lisa. And I think there's a lot of similarities between a great artist and a thief. So, Derek, thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you very much. Your book, again, is Hitmakers of Popularity, The Science of Popularity in Age of Distraction. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. This is great fun.
Okay, we'll come back. We're going to the most popular part of our program. It's called Ask Robert.
You're listening to The Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Every business owner and real estate investor needs asset protection. Entities like LLCs, S or C Corps are vital to protect yourself and your business. Let Corporate Direct guide you through the process of forming a corporation or LLC. Corporate Direct is owned by Rich Dad advisor Garrett Sutton and is Robert Kiyosaki's choice for corporate formation. Mention Rich Dad and receive $100 off a formation. Call 800-600-1760. That's 800-600-1760. Or visit online at corporatedirect.com. That's corporatedirect.com.
The key to achieving your dreams is to develop a rich mindset instead of an excuse mindset. Instead of saying, I can't afford that, ask yourself, how can I afford that? It's amazing how a simple shift in thinking can open a world of new ideas and endless possibilities. Let the Rich Dad Company help kickstart your journey to financial freedom. Robert Kiyosaki and the Rich Dad Company have compiled Robert's top secrets to creating a rich mindset, now available in a 10-minute ebook, How to Achieve a Rich Mindset. This offer is available for a limited time only, so get yours today. Get your free ebook, How to Achieve a Rich Mindset. Go to richdad.com and look for the banner. Again, this is available only for a few days, so act fast. Go to richdad.com and look for the How to Achieve a Rich Mindset banner.
Log on to richdadradio.com while you listen. Now back to Robert Kiyosaki.
Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. I want to thank our guest today, Derek Thompson. Very important book for all of you who want fame, hits, money, success, notoriety, whatever it is, called Hitmakers, The Science and Popularity in Age of Distraction. It's one of the best things about the Rich Dad Radio Show is I get to talk to some very smart people. So anyway, for those of you who are very smart people listening to the show, I'd like to just say a couple of things. Is that I've had so many hits that were mega hits in my life, but I never knew what I did. When I read Hitmakers, I began to understand what I was doing. Like my first big hit was a nylon and Velcro surfer wallet business. I started that business when I was about 19. And it was a goofy product. I was sailing in New York at my school, Kings Point Merchant Marine Academy, and our wallets kept rotting away, our leather wallets. So we started taking old sails from our sailboats, and we started sewing, colorful little wallets. And we go around and show them to people, and they say, can I have these wallets? And yada, 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 yada. We never thought anything of it. And then later, when I decided I'd become an entrepreneur, I said, well, I've been sewing these stupid wallets. I don't even like the wallet. I did it because I could go on the water with them. That was all. But we made them in goofy colors and all this stuff, and then we took it to market. I'm now like 25 or 26, about 10 years later, and everybody says, stupid idea. I call them ripper wallets. This is really stupid. And so exactly as Derek Thompson of Hitmaker says, it was most advanced, yet not acceptable. He said, why would anybody carry a nylon wallet? So meanwhile, I'd already shipped off to, raise a lot of money, shipped the wallets to New York's Long Island and all this stuff, and we were going broke fast, and you had to think. So I said, well, what is acceptable? I was too far outside the box. And I was reading this article about a runner in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco had his car keys stolen. I mean, his car was stolen. So why was his car stolen? Because a runner had no place to put their keys. And now this is the baby boomers were just realizing they're getting fat, so they're starting to jog. Nobody was jogging until that time. So they had this key. So he put his car key on top of his wheel of his car, which I was doing the same thing. And he took a run, and his car was gone. So the question was in the paper, what does a runner do with his or her key? So I built this thing called a shoe pocket. Same material, same little dinky little thing. And again, everybody laughed about it, but it was acceptable. I went from a bigger wallet, men's wallet, to a shoe wallet. And of course, nobody accepted it, but then I took it to the New York Sporting Goods Show, ran ads. I was up to my eyeballs in debt, and ran that, and that little dinky shoe pocket took off. You know, I was in Runner's World, I made Playboy magazine, I got all the PR, I got the exposure, distribution, and then people kept saying, well, what you got left? What else have you got? I said, well, I got 100,000 of these wallets sitting in my factory. That's what Derek is talking about at Hitmakers. Just like the Mona Lisa was stolen. That's what made it successful. So if you read Hitmakers, you begin to understand the logic of it. And the trouble is most people are too chicken to make those mistakes. So I went bust on the wallet business because I was too successful. The shoe pocket nobody cared about after a while, but the nylon wallet took off all over the world, and I got competition, all this stuff, and I couldn't finance it. Success was wiping me out. So I went bust. I had to go smaller again. And then I said, well, what is next? And then I saw this company in Honolulu called 98 Rock. It's a rock and roll company. And I went to knocked on the door of the radio station. I said, what is this 98 Rock? It was a black with orange and white lettering, 98 Rock. And he said, every kid loves it. I said, why is that? This is because they hate disco. I went, oh. So the kids were changing the trend right at that point. And I was older than the kids, the surfer guys. They had little 98 Rock bumper stickers all over the place. So I just asked for the license to put 98 Rock on my wallets. And golly, I went smaller. I target exactly as Hitmaker says, I targeted that market. That thing took off, and again, it nearly wiped me out because damn thing went all over the world. I was selling 98 Rock wallets all over the world, and hats and wallets and T-shirts. And then one day this guy comes up to me and says, hi, I work for a band called Pink Floyd. I said, really? He goes, yeah. He says, I want you to work with us. And so then I was in the rock and roll business with Pink Floyd, Duran Duran, Iron Maiden, Boys. Again, the same problem. I couldn't finance success. We got so big so fast, it was wiping us out. And then a thing called MTV came along. And God almighty, I went to J.C. Penney's. I was all over the world. You know, I was just doing what Hitmaker says. So I went crashing down again because I was too successful. So that's why we have the Rich Dad radio show. Then I now have Rich Dad. And so please read Hitmakers because he can tell you what I did better than I can tell you what I did. And so now I got Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Now we have Rich Dad TV, my latest book coming out, Why the Rich Are Getting Richer. And I got that idea from him because I had done TED Talks last year. I said, why don't I just put television in a book? In the age of Trump, I can't get any PR. I used to get tons of public relations. I was always on TV shows and all that. Trump sucks the air out of that thing. So because I read Hitmakers by Derek Thompson, I have Rich Dad TV, and I have 10 lessons on how to awaken your financial genius in a book. So you can share your friends. So exactly as Derek Thompson says, your success is not your customer, but your customer's audience. And that's why the Rich Dad radio show is the same thing. We want you to talk to your friends. It's called viral. In other words, it's also called people to people. You know, very important way of getting things done. Cashflow board game was designed for people to teach people and bypass the school system. So anyway, thank you for listening to the Rich Dad radio programs. What's the first question, Melissa?
Our first question today comes from Eric in New York. Favorite book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. He says, Robert, do you think if you published Rich Dad, Poor Dad today instead of when you did, that it would still be a hit?
Absolutely. Exactly as Derek Thompson says, it's the context, it's the frame. I didn't go, it's called Maya, most advanced yet acceptable. How do you get financial education into the brain of a person who's never had any? They're taught to go to school and get a job and save money and exactly as Derek says, live below your means. And I don't do any of that. But how do I say that and not act like a whack job out there? So it's a true story. I had a rich dad and a poor dad. But I only wrote the book because I had to sell the cash flow game. Because the cash flow game was a takeoff on Monopoly. But how did I communicate that to a public with no financial education and is run by a bunch of people like Bernie Sanders, Obama, and Hillary? Very, very academically smart people like my poor dad, but financially paupers. You know, they have no financial experience. That's why our country is going bust financially. How can you keep spending money, racking up liabilities and debt, and not bring any more money in when people are losing their jobs left and right? So today, a rich dad, poor dad would be more viable because we're talking about how Amazon is moving into Australia, but Amazon also took over Whole Foods. Whole Foods prides itself in paying their employees lots of money. Amazon's going to cut their wages. They're going to just take them out of the equation. You're going to walk in with your cell phone and you don't need a checkout person anymore. So all of you out there who think, oh, well, you know, Rich Dad, Poor Dad was at the time. Rich Dad, Poor Dad was written for today. What do you do when you've been told to go to school, get a job, work hard, save money, and invest for the long term in the stock market and your house is an asset? What do? You better look at some new ideas. And Rich Dad, Poor Dad is an idea that time has finally come. Next question, Melissa.
Our next question comes from Ramona in Phoenix, Arizona. Favorite book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. She says, as an investor, what qualities and features particularly gets you interested in investing in a business plan?
Almost nothing. You know, I always look for the credentials, but most business plans, I don't look at them anymore because, you know, you have to look at the people. I mean, my doctor called me in, my neighbor called me in, they're all in partnership now. My neighbor is a billionaire, my doctor is a wannabe. And they have this new product, and they invited me in to look at the new product. And first thing I did was I looked at the team around him. So this is right across the street from me. And people were all losers. I hate to say that. I mean, I couldn't believe the team they had assembled. I mean, they were all employees who needed money. So one of the things I look for, you can watch Shark Tank, you'll see the same thing. You know, most people want the paycheck. They don't want to really start a business. So when I saw that, you know, I was a typical jerk I am. So my friend who's a billionaire is financing this doctor, and he assembled his team of wannabes. None of them had any real experience, and all they cared about was their paycheck. When I saw that, I lost it. Kim had to drag me out with a choke chain, you know. I said, you're ripping her off. My friend was a billionaire. You're ripping her off. And she didn't earn the money either. She inherited it. Well, she actually divorced her husband for it. So none of them had any real entrepreneurial experience. They all claimed to be, but they weren't. They wanted that paycheck. So once I smell that, I'm out of the deal so fast. And unfortunately, the business failed. And they don't talk to me anymore. I mean, I lost some good friends. Kim still puts me on a muzzle and a choke chain when I go out. But anyway, I thank you all for listening to the Rich Dad radio program. You'll hear my ideas and all this. But anyway, it's an exciting time because as Derek Thompson and Hitmakers are talking about UI, which is universal income, it means how do you survive when you don't need workers? I think that's the most important question. So his book, Hitmakers, The Science of Popularity in the Age of Distraction, very important book. I thank him for that. And all of you who are listening, you can submit your questions to AskRobert@RichDadRadio.com. And I thank you for listening because this is not a time to be going back to school and hoping for that mythical, magical, high-paying job or investing for the long term in the stock market because it's about to go down. Thank you for listening.